Since the National Hockey League was founded in 1917, there have been more than 10,000 NHL players, and not a single one has ever come out as gay, bisexual, or any other variety of queer. But at the turn of the 20th century, the most famous athlete in the United States was an amateur hockey player named Hobey Baker, and he was almost certainly queer. Welcome back to Yesterqueers. My name's Amanda, and I'm a public historian of queer history. Hobey Baker was one of the greatest athletes of all time, and one of the first superstar athletes in American history. Preternaturally skilled at any sport he tried, he is the only person ever to have been inducted into both the College Football Hall of Fame and the Hockey Hall of Fame. He set records in the early 1900s in both sports, some of which weren't broken until the 1960s, and he has a collegiate hockey award named after him. And yet, most people in the US have never heard his name, in part because his life was cut tragically short by World War I. Hobart Amory Hare Baker was born January 15, 1892, to a prominent family in Philadelphia, the younger of two sons. He did not have a happy childhood. His parents had a difficult relationship that was a constant source of gossip among Philadelphia's elite, and neither of them were particularly interested in parenting their sons. After the two finally divorced when Hobey was 11, he and his older brother Thornton were shipped off to an exclusive boarding school in New Hampshire called St. Paul's. St. Paul's is the cradle of American hockey. The first hockey game ever played in the U.S. was played on St. Paul's Lower School Pond, November 17, 1883. Hobey was already playing football, but he loved hockey, so much that he was known for sneaking out of his room at night to practice stick handling for hours on the Lower School Pond. It was too dark to see the puck most nights, so he learned to stick handle without looking down, a skill that is still crucial to playing high-level hockey today. Modern hockey is played with 6 players on the ice, 3 forwards, 2 defensemen, and a goalie. But at the turn of the 20th century, it was played with 7. That additional position was called a rover, and it could play anywhere on the ice, forward or defense. Since substituting players also wasn't really a thing at the turn of the 20th century, rovers had to be the strongest players. Hobey Baker was a rover, and he was unmatched. His exceptional skill, combined with custom skates that he designed with a trainer named Max Smith, made him incredibly fast and agile. The St. Paul's hockey team was so good in Hobey's era that they regularly beat the varsity hockey teams at Ivy League colleges like Princeton and Harvard. When Hobey followed in his father's footsteps and entered Princeton himself in the fall of 1910, he played both football and hockey. Neither the NFL nor the NHL existed yet, so college sports, especially in what would become the Ivy League, were national news, and Hobey was a superstar. While playing football, he broke or set every collegiate record. He was named All-American in the same year as Jim Thorpe, and he made a tackle in a 1913 game against Yale that football historians still write about. But hockey was where he really shone. In 1912, the New York Tribune said of Baker, "The lightning-like rover had so much speed that it was next to impossible to check him when he once got underway." Old followers of hockey declared Baker to be as fast as the best of the Canadian professionals. He once again set or broke every conceivable college record, including most goals in a season, 35, and most goals in a single game, 8. He played varsity hockey for Princeton for 3 years and only got 1 penalty in that time, because in addition to being an athlete beyond compare, Hobey Baker was the embodiment of a gentleman athlete. According to ESPN Searching for Hobey Baker, those who played with Hobey or watched him from the grandstands would remark on how he played the game with grace, a firm commitment to fair play, and always with good sportsmanship, and did so in a manner that has rarely been equaled. He was kind to younger players and generous with his time to mentor them. He was known to be modest in victory and graceful in defeat, and he was endlessly patient with fans, although he usually brushed off praise for himself and redirected it back to his team. The only place that Hobey was a little bit of a showboat was on the field or on the ice. He refused to wear a helmet, and his golden blonde hair made him impossible to miss. Hobey wanted people to see him playing, to see him dominating. It was while he was at Princeton that Hobey met a Princeton alum named Percy Rivington Pine II, who was about 10 years his senior. Percy was fabulously wealthy. He had inherited an astonishing fortune and then grown it on Wall Street, and he was known to be a lavish entertainer. He once recreated an entire Parisian boulevard for a pregame dinner before a Vanderbilt ball. Percy Pine was also gay. In fact, he was the archetypal gay bachelor hiding in plain sight in early 20th century Manhattan. And so was Hobey in a way. He was the pinnacle of American masculinity. J.C. Leyendecker could very well have had him in the back of his mind while he was creating the Arrow Collar Man, and Baker was known to have no interest in women. A college friend said of Hobey, with his lean but well-muscled figure and his handsome, manly yet boyish face, he was someone who would appeal to both men and women alike, before noting that he couldn't remember Hobey ever getting acquainted with a woman. This was a time in the US when sleeping with someone of the same sex was considered an action and not necessarily an indication of identity. So people wouldn't necessarily have seen it as a conflict that Hobey was a stereotypically masculine athlete and that he preferred the company of men. We hadn't yet gotten to the point where homosexual, heterosexual, and bisexual were considered identities, so there was space for queer relationships in the early 20th century, at least for wealthy, cis white men. Hobey was at loose ends after he graduated from Princeton. His father had officially run out of money, so he had to take a boring, low-level job at JP Morgan. He had more than enough skill to play hockey professionally in Canada and to be paid well for it, but he thought the idea of playing sports for money was crass. He revered what he saw as the pure competition of amateur sport. When Percy saw how hard Hobey was floundering, he invited him to move in with him to his Madison Avenue mansion, and he drew Hobey into this sort of Great Gatsby lifestyle. Percy was a member of dozens of private clubs, and he had multiple mansions, so they spent their time partying, playing polo, racing cars, whatever you might think that wealthy men at the turn of the 20th century would do to amuse themselves. Percy and Hobey did it. Percy also showered Hobey with gifts, for instance, marking the date that they moved in together with this engraved silver cigarette case. Percy's support also meant that Hobey was able to join the St. Nick's amateur hockey team, where he continued to dazzle crowds of thousands and to make headlines with his exceptional skill. When Hobey Baker and St. Nick's had the audacity to beat the Montreal Stars in their own arena in front of a crowd of 10,000 Canadians, a Montreal newspaper begrudgingly wrote, "Uncle Sam has had the cheek to develop a first-class hockey player. We didn't want St. Nick's to win, but Baker cooked our goose so artistically that we enjoyed it." As the drums of the First World War beat ever closer, Hobey joined Manhattan's Air National Guard unit. This was, I think, only 10 years after the Wright brothers' very first flight, but a group of wealthy white men in New York realized that the air war was going to be crucial to success in World War I, so they essentially took it upon themselves to learn how to fly and to organize what were reserve aviation units before the US government had even joined the war. I'm sure it will not surprise you to learn that Hobey Baker was just as good at flying as he was at playing hockey. In early 1917, Hobey abruptly left New York and moved to Philadelphia to live with his brother and sister-in-law. No one is exactly sure why. I personally suspect that he and Percy had a falling out, but it wasn't enough to end their relationship because the two of them spent several days together in New York before Hobey was shipped out on July 23rd, 1917. The two wrote dozens of letters to each other during the 18 months that Hobey was on the front lines, although all of Percy's letters to Hobey mysteriously disappeared while Baker's effects were being transported back to New York after his death. We still have many of Hobey's letters, though, in which he pours his heart out about his fears of never seeing Percy again and how much he misses him. Hobey was in his element as a combat pilot and a squadron commander, so when the First World War ended in November of 1918 and he received his discharge papers the next month, he lobbied to be able to stay in France until his entire squadron could go home together, but his request was denied. When Hobey returned to his squadron after that meeting on December 21st, 1918, he was despondent at the thought of leaving. So he decided that he wanted to take one last flight before he had to give up flying forever and return to civilian life. The weather was awful. It was pouring rain. And airmen are very superstitious about calling any flight your last, but Hobey was insistent. His plane was parked at the back of the hangar and not easily accessible, so he decided to take one that had recently been repaired, saying that it was his responsibility as the squadron commander to test it before any of his men flew it. Just a few minutes into his flight, the newly repaired motor on Hobey Baker's plane cut out. For reasons unknown, he did not immediately try to glide into what's called a pancake landing, a move that he would have done dozens of times before. And instead, he did what pilots were never supposed to do and tried to turn back to the airfield. When he was about 90 feet above the ground, the plane started to spin, at which point he did point the nose down to try to glide into an emergency landing, but he was too close to the ground. Hobey Baker's plane slammed into the ground, nose first, and he died shortly after being pulled from the wreckage by his friend and mentor, Lieutenant Hef Herring. He was 26 years old. After his death, Percy Pine oversaw the building of Princeton's Hobey Baker Memorial Rink, where the Tigers hockey team still play to this day. That's it for today. As always, more information, including sources and further reading, is available in the usual place.